All right, YouTube Live. Thank you for tuning in, and welcome to another edition of the live Q&A sessions. These are largely for me to help support the questions that I get from the members of my website, Golf Smart Academy. So most of the questions have been sent in previously, but if you have a question, I'll be checking periodically over in the chat window. So if I say something that piques your interest and you want to know about it, type it in there and I'll do my best to get to it. Now, I did have a good number of questions this time, so I'm not quite sure how many of the chat questions I'll be able to get to. But I like to break them into themes based on the questions, or these Facebook Live events, I like to break them into themes based on the questions that I get. And it seemed like a lot of the questions this time were revolving around taking your game from the range to the course. So taking your game from the driving range or just your stock swing, and then being able to perform either under pressure or just on the course. So I'll jump into some of these questions. First question I had was from David, and he was asking what happens to your body under pressure. So why is it that you can shoot 72 with some of your friends, but then you get in a tournament and it's hard to break 80, right? So in general, what happens under pressure is your stress response, right? And when you get put in a stressful environment, you get some hormone adaptations, and I get real quick, I sent a chat right before I got started, but in case you didn't get it, please introduce yourself when you ask a question. It'll help me know who is talking and prioritize what to do. Anyway, back to David's question. So getting under pressure, you get hormone response, you get more blood flow going to your core muscles, the muscles that are designed to either fight or flight and help you run away from stuff, and you get less blood flow going to your arms and your forearms. Under stress, you rarely would need, evolutionarily, you wouldn't need a whole lot of fine motor skills. So typically what will happen is your forearm movements will become more robotic a little bit, and your core muscles, your power sources will tend to get amplified. So a couple common scenarios. One would be like early extension, and two would be like an upper body spin. So in early extension, I have to time the flip, and my upper body is going to back away from the golf ball. Well, under pressure, my core muscles are going to pull me a little bit more or a little further away from the golf ball, or it might pull at a slightly different timing because now there's more blood flow going to that part of my body. So that puts more of a, let's say, timing component to the exact timing of when I flip in order to control low point. And so what can happen under pressure is you start to have a little bit of poorer performance because you have these things that are now slightly out of sequence instead of working well together like they were doing when you were in rhythm on the range. Basically, when you're in rhythm on the range, all that means is that the timing of your movements are matching up so that you're pretty precise with where you're controlling the bottom. But when you get on the course, some of those timings can change. And so that's part of the reason why we train more of a centered location of your pivot and an earlier closing of the club face, because that doesn't take nearly as much timing as that does. And so if I do that motion, which usually accompanies early extension, if I do that motion down at the bottom, I'm going to have fat shots, thin shots. I could have heel toe depending on what's going on with my body or what's going on with my shoulders. So it creates more inconsistency. And then you get nervous on top of being stressed, and that typically causes you to do it even worse. And then what happens is usually you have a few bad holes, you burn off kind of that nervous energy, your body starts to come back down, and then you play well and you save the round. The other option would be golfers who are a little bit more of an upper body lunge and pull, right? And then they have to bend and chicken wing like this. Well, what can happen is under pressure, they either pull a little sooner because of the increased blood flow, or they pull a little harder, which causes their chicken wing to happen a little bit later. And that combination causes just as many contact problems. So that's the general recipe as to why your ball striking would get worse under pressure. Now, we can look at situations like David also asked about JB Holmes, having that 4 minutes in between his shots on Sunday. What can happen is when you start going into that stress response, you can either have what we call an upward spiral, where you start building a whole lot of anxiety, or you have a downward spiral where you start building a whole lot of doom and gloom. This is never going to work. There's a whole section just in front of your spine, these nerve ganglion, and their whole job is to help you physically manifest emotions. For example, the classic one is someone who is depressed isn't going to be walking around with their chest out, right? They're going to typically walk around with their chest depressed and taking kind of short, shallow breaths. Well, there are physical relationships to each emotion. And so if you have different emotional control on the range as you do on the course, that can change some of the geometry. And when we're dealing with a sport where the object is moving 100 plus miles an hour and the difference between a good shot is 1 degree or 2 degrees of face angle, now you start changing these big body movements and you're going to get less consistent. In JB Holmes' case, I think he just kind of got into one of those spirals and started kind of overthinking himself. And that'll transition us to one of another question that I had, which is relating to what you should think about more when you're on the course. Like, should you focus on certain body parts? And that question came from Sharon. She was asking basically how much awareness to specific muscles in the kinematic sequence should you have, and should that change from practice to playing? So when there's a simple little path as far as what's going on during the round of golf, right? You're going to have everybody's describing them differently. I talk about it in my book. P and Lynn have done a whole lot with it, but basically you have before the shot, they call it the think box. You've got during the shot, the play box, after the shot, memory zone or memory box. Basically, what are you going to do before the shot while you're executing, and how are you going to respond to it? Well, before the shot, your goal is to make that as simple as possible. But you want to factor in all the information and get 100% committed to a decision. There's some simple little applied kinesiology things you can do to show yourself that if you have doubt, you will have a different level of tension going on in your body than if you are confident. It's been duplicated in many studies. I use it all the time. And there's two different places that you really want to look at. Do I have doubt? One is my mind, which is this the right shot? Hey, it's a dogleg left and there's water on the left. Do I really want to hit this draw around the corner, or am I scared of the water, right? Or do I want to play a little bit safer? That's more intellectual. And then you've got your gut response, which would be more like, okay, I look at it, it looks like a draw. Logically, it should be a draw, but you know what? I'm just feeling more of a fade in my body. Maybe it's the lie of the tee box or something, but I'm feeling more of this fade shot. Well, if you have a conflict between what's going on in your mind and what you're feeling in your body, always go with your body. It's deeper, it's more primal, it's more connected to movement. So if you start going just with your intellect, you're gonna go down some bad pathways. And I think JB was struggling with what did he want to do versus what did he think he should do. So that takes us to the question from Sharon about where should you be paying attention. Well, we'll break your brain into like two different sections. You got like language centers, which would be like areas where you're consciously aware. So like if you're hearing yourself talk, you're in the language center because you're using words. Then you have sensations. So what do I see? What do I hear? What do I feel? all that great stuff. So you've got language centers or aware, like actual words, and then you've got feelings. When you're executing, when you're in that play box, operation zone, you want to be feeling, you do not want to be thinking. So what can happen on the course is you get on the course and you start running more of a checklist. And you're telling yourself, okay, what did I work on in my last lesson? Making sure that I do it. And you become you're reminding yourself of what you were doing, but you're moving yourself to the wrong part of the brain. Where when you're on the range and you're just kind of swinging, you're probably not talking to yourself too much. You may be using a verbal cue to cue a physical movement, but for the most part, you're just moving. You're just kind of in repetition zone, in movement zone, more in sensing zone. So the key is building a pre-shot routine that helps you get into the movement zone. And that last stage of your pre-shot routine is thinking about what shot do I want to hit and what am I going to feel or what am I going to try to sense when I'm in that play box. If you don't have those two figured out, then you're probably going to struggle when you get under pressure. The other question related to awareness and what you should be thinking, feeling. Another subcategory of that problem would be when you're in that play box, you want to make sure that you're experiencing the whole swing and not breaking or not focusing individually on one part. So let's say you're working on early extension, and so you're working on keeping your body down and maybe shallowing a bit more with your arms and maybe a little earlier closing. So you're working on those things. What you want to do is when you're building that pre-shot thought, you want to make sure it includes how the swing starts, how the swing evolves, and then how the swing ends, so that you can have focus and kind of clarity of what movement you're going to do or what swing you're going to make during the entire swing. If you only have a backswing thought and you get up there and then your brain is kind of like, well, what was I supposed to do next? That can create a little extra tension. That could create a little bit less consistent, let's say, energy transfer. That can mess up the bottom of your swing. That can mess up your sequencing a little bit. So while you can be focused on one part of your swing, you need a general global focus of how that's going to interact with the whole swing, not just that one area. So that's part of the reason why on the course, typically external focus do pretty well for a lot of golfers. Now, I'm on the oddball end of the spectrum where I've put the devices on, and when I focus on movements, my brain is calmer. I perform better. I execute better than if I just think about the target. There was one study done that showed that if you focused on, they basically just interviewed major champion winners, and they found that there were 4 common things that they paid attention to. One had a specific feeling of what they wanted their body to do during the swing. One had a specific feeling of what they wanted the club to do. One had no thought whatsoever, and the other group had target thoughts only. So it shows that you can have different areas of focus and execute well. But I always caution my golfers with using the word swing thought and trying to get it into more of a swing feeling. Okay, so that gives kind of a general picture as far as what you're trying to do when you go to the course. You're going to try and get into this feel zone by using a good pre-shot routine, so you can have both your heart or both your body and your brain committed to the shot, and you have one clear focus to execute during the shot. Now, what are some of the other challenges when you go from the range to the course? Well, when you go to the course, you're going to have uneven lies, you're going to have different distances, and many amateurs don't practice that. So I had another question from David about if you had approximately 10 hours per week, how would you break it up? So if you had 10 hours a week for practice, so not counting like rounds that you're playing with people and kind of, your buddies, your weekend rounds, your middle of the week rounds, 10 hours for practice. I would roughly, let's say I'd take 4 hours of that and I'd want to be practicing on the course. So that could be whatever I'm working on with my game, I'm going to be doing in the course environment. The other 6 hours, I would do about 2/3 ball striking, 1/3 short game. So I got 6 hours. I'm going to spend 4 of it working on ball striking, prioritizing iron play and shots off the tee. And then I'm going to work on, for 2 hours, I'm going to work on wedge play, chipping, pitching, putting. Chipping, pitching, basically my stock shots inside 20 yards. Distance wedges would probably get maybe a half hour, 45 minutes tops. And then putting would probably get a full, so we'll say half hour for chipping, pitching, half hour for distance wedge, hour for putting, and then the rest of the time for ball striking. I still had that 4 hours on the course where I get to work on those things, but in more the game environment. The metaphor, the analogy I give is, imagine you were in school and you had one classroom where you took every single test. So you had like your learning zone where you went and hung out with your friends and paid attention to class, and then you had this other room where you went and that's where you took every test. Imagine the response you'd have when you walk towards the test. Sometimes you might be really confident going to that room, other times you might be really depressed, but there would definitely be a change in how you felt going to that classroom because this was a special testing environment. And I find that a lot of golfers make the mistake of creating that situation out of the golf course, where they only go on the golf course to keep score. Every tour pro I've ever worked with, every good amateur collegiate golfer, we do a lot of practicing on the course. So like, let's say I get in a good groove with my swing, I'm just going to go play 3 or 5 holes and practice on the course. Now, I recognize that some of you may be at more public courses, public facilities, and you can't do that. But I'm giving you what I think is optimal. So even if it's doing like twilight rounds by yourself where you can get some practice in on the course, I think that's very helpful. I have a number of ways to do variety practice on the range that can help. And I've been doing some success with, okay, what happens on the course is you face these uneven lies, right? So when you're facing these uneven lies, you're going to change a little bit how you're going to power the swing. So you can't use your legs as well. You got to use a little bit more upper body. Your weight distribution will be a little bit different. So essentially, it's like moving the ball position and stance around. So I do little games on the range where I have you move the ball position forward, move the ball position backward, put weight left, weight right, swing more arms, swing more legs, or closed stance, open stance. And by adding some of those variety and trying to duplicate the same shot shape, it forces your brain to work the equation of how do I swing this club the same way but using a different pattern. And because that's ultimately what you have to do on the course. If you play a lot of flat courses and you just need to work more on trajectory and distance control, then I do more things working on off-speed hits and tempo drills. But if you're playing courses that have slopes like our home course, messing around with ball position and different stances can help it transfer over. Okay, so now I'm just going to jump into some of these more general questions. Let's see, where do we want to start? Okay, Mike asked about if you're shanking the trail arm only drill, why might that happen? So let me grab the club. Essentially, on a shank, I've got my mini club here. We'll be able to see if I'm doing my trail arm only drill. If the club and the hosel is moving out that way, that would be one cause of the shank, or if the club face is coming in super wide open, that would be another cause of the shank. The things that are going to move my hand and the hosel out that way would be more of an early extension pattern. So some golfers shifting too much into their toes and moving their hands into out will cause more of that shank pattern. And one of the other common ones is if you're getting more of the movement through the ball from straightening that arm into the ball as opposed to having more of that trail wrist rotation and a little bit more of that white movement, which delays the straightening of the arm. If you straighten your arm, think about it this way. I'm set up, I've got a probably 20 degrees, 30 degrees of arm bend. If I just straighten that arm, that by itself can move the club further out. So what I would need to do is if I straighten my arm, I would need to stand up the right amount or early extend to bring it back in place. And when you're doing these small drills, it's rare that you would have enough early extension to compensate for that early arm action. So I'd work on rotating the club and getting the arm to extend through the shot instead of into the shot. That usually clears up the shanks. But at the very least, I would do the shank drill where you put tees at different spots, just outside, just inside, to get aware of where the club is. He had another question about if you get toe deep, why would you want more early? Why would you want more ulnar deviation? Well, the way that the wrists work is somewhat in combination. They're not pure movements. So you would assume that, okay, the club is like this, and then I go toe deep, or I ulnar deviate and it goes down like that. But what actually happens is I ulnar deviate, so then it actually rotates the face a little bit more and creates more shaft lean. So you see, I barely went more toe deep. What I really did was ulnar deviation. Now the camera's going to show it going a little bit more like a lefty, but the ulnar deviation creates more shaft lean, kind of like this, and it creates that width in the way through. It doesn't necessarily create a whole lot of toe down drop. Toe down drop tends to happen more when you're getting a lot of flexion of that trail wrist, because what will happen there is that flexion of the trail wrist will tend to pull the toe in and across. So then when I have my body, usually that's accompanied with a little bit of a stall pattern, but if I have that pattern coming across like this, that's going to cause that toe to dig not just this way and under like you would think a flip would do, but it'll actually take the trail wrist into ulnar deviation sooner. So trying to get that lead wrist ulnar deviation helps create that forward shaft lean. And the tricky thing with the trail wrist is getting the ulnar deviation while maintaining the extension, because if you start going into flexion, then you'll typically go into internal rotation, and that by itself will, if I exaggerate it, make the toe a little bit deeper than the heel. So ulnar deviation is one of those key movements for shallowing out the swing from the arms and allowing for forearm rotation, which creates shaft lean. So if you're not doing that movement, it can create a whole host of contact problems. Before I jump into some of the other emailed questions, I see that we've got a few coming in here in the chat window. All right, Mike asked, I tend to stand more vertically as the round progresses, probably due to casting and fear of hitting it fat. Yes, I would say that that's a common trait. It's good to know what happens to your body under pressure, or under fatigue in this case. And that's why training adaptability is more important than training consistency. You can work on your endurance in training and in the gym and stuff like that, but it's also good to work on the skills where you can hit a solid shot from a slightly taller posture. You can hit a solid shot from more arm action. Because if I knew that I was casting, I would basically take a half more club and play a little cut, and I could probably score pretty well doing that. So knowing what's going to happen to you under pressure or under fatigue is really important. There was one year where I recognized that most of my rounds under par that year came in second rounds of 36-hole tournaments. So it was interesting because I made the connection that basically as I got more fatigued, my lower body got quieter and I got a little less early extension. Like I got more contribution of the upper body, and I could hit more like flighted irons where the first round I typically took more full cuts at stuff. And my proximity to the hole got better when I would hit these more flighted iron shots. So I learned from that I needed to practice more of these flighted iron shots and not just rely on being tired in order to do so. Daniel is asking, Do you find competitive practice, such as a small wager, helpful to bridge between practice and the course, or is competition a distraction from what you were trying to actually accomplish? No, so talking with Debbie Cruz, who's one of the kind of grandmothers of the neuroscience stuff, she reiterated multiple times that you just have to elevate the stress level a little bit in order to train the brain to what it's going to experience when you get under pressure. It's not that you have to get it all the way to what it's going to feel like Sunday at the Masters in order to have the benefit. So little games, little small wagers. In addition to variety practice, I like to have my students try to hit 3 or 5 good shots in a row. So let's say you're just, you've hit a bunch of 7-irons. Now you're like, okay, in order to switch clubs, I got to hit 3 perfect 7-irons in a row. And just having that pressure on the third one of, okay, I gotta focus on this, will elevate things enough that it will show you what kind of disruptions you're going to get, and it'll help you learn to train the pattern in a more stressed state. So good question. Patrick Miller, can we see the net force on 2D video? There is one on both the site and on YouTube. Send me a direct question to support@golfsmartacademy.com, because I'm not quite sure what that's related to, but that will I can get you the link to whatever video you're hoping to watch there. Okay, back to the the emailed questions. Tom asked about external rotation of the lead knee and hip. So basically asking, Dana Dahlquist, George Gankus are 2 other popular online golf instructors, and they never talk about the Jackson 5, was one of his comments. So I would say that I'm typically working with a higher handicap golfer than it appears that they are working with. So here's how I think through the process. We know that from 3D and motion analysis that the pelvis moves about 4 to 6 inches towards the target during the downswing. Now, I've done literally thousands of 3Ds on high handicap golfers, and rarely do I see them moving more than 3 inches. Now, that being said, I have a number of juniors where that's moving 10 inches towards the target. So when I have golfers who have really excessive pelvis movement and getting 10 inches of movement towards the target, I cue them to work a little bit more, almost feeling like their hips are going that way and their upper body is going to cover, very much like, a movement that you might see from George or Dana. But if you already have more of a spin, then getting that early bump that a lot of good competitive golfers have described typically helps out, especially the higher handicap slice golfer or golfer who slices the ball. So I don't think there's one right feeling. I say this all the time. Your feels change. If I ask you how you, I've had students do this where I'll say, you know what, just for fun, in the morning and in the evening, just write down how your body feels. Just do it for a week. And what you'll find is that your body does not feel exactly the same every single day. So if you're looking for an absolute feeling that you're going to be able to use forever with your swing, you're going down the wrong path. What you want is relationships and ball flights, and you need maybe 4 or 5 different feels that help you get the face to path you want, get the low point control you want, get the power sources that you want in order to produce good shots. Because one other thing with taking it to the course is you have to recognize when do you have your A game, when do you have your B game, when do you have your C game, and how do you adapt your strategy on the course based on how your body is feeling that day. And if you're the type of person who just says, you know what, I feel the same every single day, and I'm looking, it should feel like this, it should feel like this, what'll happen is you'll get into a good groove where the feel works, and then you'll come out the next day, you'll try the feel, and it doesn't work because you don't have a calibration. So, for example, going external in your hips is great if it improves your sequencing and gets you that 4 to 6 inches of pelvis shift. If going external in your lead hip causes your hips actually to stay more over the right foot and not have a whole lot of shift, and your upper body does actually get ahead of it, then you're probably going to struggle a lot with the longer clubs. So if trying the Jackson 5 causes you to get 10 inches of shift, or you already have 10 inches of shift, then trying something like the external rotation of the lead knee could be very helpful. So you got to know your swing and your pattern and figure out drills that are based on good checkpoints to help get you to actually do it, and then you can come up with what it should feel like. I don't think everybody should have the same feels. All right, Dean asked about hand path going outward early. How do you get it to go back in while the club goes out? This is a very kind of hot topic, which is basically during transition. Here, we'll angle that up a little bit. Good. So during transition, the handle will have a force that takes it out this way. Now, oftentimes it looks a little bit more like this, where basically my hands are moving that way. I'll exaggerate it. My hands are moving that way, and the club is moving that way. There's a difference. They're not moving in the same direction. So, like in this, the club is moving that way, and my hands are moving that way. If they go in the same direction, if your club and your hands goes in the same direction, then when your hands go to the left, the club is going to follow it. So they go in the same direction, and then they go to the left. Well, what that means, the way that the tour pros are able to get this look, where basically the hands are going in as the club is going out, that happens from this little shallow movement of letting the club's sweet spot drop behind the hand path, so that then when I pull in, it's going to line back up and it's going to fly out like that. So basically, if you have a hard time getting that movement, then you're going to have a hard time getting the hands to go left. What will typically happen is if the hands work more down and they're in line with the club, then they'll tend to go more out through the ball. And if they go out through the ball, you'll tend to have a little more fat-thin contact, a little shorter flat spot. Might struggle with overhooking the ball, definitely would struggle with wedges. So if you're having trouble getting your hands to go to the left, then I would say you got to work on the shallow movement early in order to set you up so that you can have that go more around and to the left. Okay, I had a question from McDonald. This is a good one. Is there a swing that is easier on the back? You know, with all these guys getting back injuries, it's tempting to go down that rabbit hole. Here's the simple science as I understand it from working more on the rehab side as well as the golf side. In order to put as little stress on the back as possible, you want to use your whole spine, your whole body as much as possible. So then it's distributing the load more evenly. Basically, when your back breaks down, there's a load put on your back that is too great for your back to handle. So you can either get your back in great shape so that it can handle more load, or distribute the load to other places, or decrease the load. So basically, you could swing slower so that there's less force coming back up, but nobody really wants to do that. So then you could try and distribute the load better by using your hips and using your spine. Usually what happens is if your rib cage becomes a block and you can't get any real rotation at the ribs, then your back tries to rotate and it's not really good at rotating, so you start to get compression. And back pain is caused by compression. It's either compression of nerves, such as sciatica or something like that. It's compression of discs, or like a disc bulge, herniation, that type of stuff, or it's a compression of bone that creates osteoarthritis. So, but back pain is caused by compression. So there are swings that you could do that would potentially produce less compression. If you're using your core well, if your ribs are turning better, if you have freedom of movement in the SI joints, if you have a lot of hip range of motion, then you don't have to take the lower back joints into quite extreme range of motion. and that would be a little bit safer. But there's a volume component. So if you had a perfect swing, perfect back, and you went out and hit 1,000 drivers at top speed, the weak link in your body is probably going to break down. So part of the challenge is now these guys are competing more year round. They're hitting, they're swinging faster with these lighter clubs. They're putting more force through the body. There's a higher demand on hitting it further than there probably ever was. There's a lot fewer Corey Pavin shot makers out there. So that recipe means that you better have your body in good working order, or you're going to have some trouble with that. He also asked about how do you identify what's the root cause of an issue? And he also asked about can early extension, what are the causes of early extension or an early release? So this is actually a good little topic. What causes, or how do you identify what's the root cause? I break it down. There's 3 main skills. You got to create speed, control the path of the club, and control the face. Controlling the path of the club is both swing direction, so where is my swing pointing, left or right, and then low point control, or where's the widest point of the swing. And then face control is both relationship to the target as well as to the path of the club. Well, I use a lot of 9-3 drills to isolate, is it a release problem? Because in a 9-3 drill, your body is usually in good position because you didn't have a transition that messed it up. And you can get the club in pretty much what position you want. So if you're doing 9-3 drills and you're making a lot of solid contact with the 9-3 and then you go to a full swing and it breaks down, then it's probably more of a transition error than it is a release error. If you struggle with 9-3s but you hit the ball better when you're doing full swings, then it probably means that you have more of a release issue. And if that's the case, specifically with early extension, oftentimes golfers who early extend hate 9-3 drills because they don't have enough time to early extend. So their release issue shows up as a problem, and they start to see that their early extension is how they control the bottom of the swing and the club face. And so they have to do some release training in order to correct that. Other golfers, no problem doing 9-3, and then they get in their full swing and they start going into early extension. Now it's more of a power problem. It's more of how you create speed is really with that back extension, leg thrust, early extension pattern. So use 9-3 drills or release drills versus full swing drills to see, is it a transition error, is it a release error, and then you can correct the problem that way. Early release it can help with low point, it can help with club face, doesn't really help with power, other than some golfers feel a lot of tension as being strong, right? They feel a lot of tension down in the bottom, and when you early release, you can kind of lock on and kind of hold on the way through instead of having more kind of softness and width to it. So it doesn't really, it can feel powerful, but it doesn't really add to creating more speed. And I had one other question about from Donald. Can you still have a good release but with bad sequencing? I thought that was an interesting question because it's basically asking, like, okay, we know that you want to have good sequencing from lower body, core, arms, club, all working together to pull on the club and create speed. And we want to have a good release where the wide point and low point is ahead of the golf ball, and those relate to each other. So it was basically asking, why do I typically train the release of either the trail arm or the lead arm? Why do I train the release before working too much on sequencing? Can you have a good release with bad sequencing? Yes. You can have a good release with bad downswing peaking order. In fact, many tour pros don't have ideal downswing peaking order. So they don't fire their body in that classic from the ground up model, but they have really good releases, so they hit the ball solidly. They can, they're more consistent, as opposed to, I've had a number of amateurs who are 10, 15 handicaps who have perfect looking kinematic sequences. Maybe they played baseball or some other sport where they learned how to create speed really well, but they're not controlling the path on the club face. So I find that most amateur golfers benefit from hitting the ball solidly, which comes from more of a good release and club face control more so than sequencing. Now, sequencing can feel really good and can be helpful for taking things to the course from the range, because it's kind of like good tempo, good rhythm. But in general, I like to make sure, I'd say 95% of the time, I'm going to train the release before I train sequencing. The only exceptions would be if you have like more of like an under flip pattern where you still have good arm extension. So it's not a perfect release, but it's good enough, and your sequencing is a higher problem there. If your release is more kind of internal rotation, bending, arms narrowing on the way through, then I'm usually going, I can't think of an exception where I'm not going release first. Okay, 2 last questions. Vaughn was asking about the hit impulse from the top. So many golfers struggle with, at the top, they just want to hit the ball as opposed to swing through it. And what are some ways that you can work on that? Ironically, doing the hit from the top drill gives you a little extra second up there where you can soften your arms and try to get your, work on your transition sequencing. That can work really well. 2 would be kind of softening your eyes and your tension and making sure that you're breathing and not holding your breath, so that you have a little bit more relaxation during that transition. Because if you're really bearing down and getting ready to apply force, that can create that hit from the top impulse. The other things that I will do is, in practice, I will do a lot of rhythm drills that almost trick you. And what I mean by that would be like pump style, where you do it 1, 2, and 3 and go. I'll do it. I'll do stuff where where golfers are brushing the ground, right? So they're making their swings and brushing the ground, and then I will put the golf ball in randomly. Some swings I won't, some swings I will, just to help them get out of the thought of I just need to hit the golf ball and get more into connection of how the club contacts the ground and make that the main focus. His other question was relating to the left shoulder as the fulcrum. So a la Chuck Quinton and rotary swing. So the main problem I have with the left arm being the fulcrum is that virtually every good ball striker has a little bit of this lead arm bend at some point during the downswing. And the lead arm typically bends about 30 degrees at the top of the swing, 20 to 30 degrees. So I think it's hard to have a really good flat spot if your image is basically the left arm staying totally straight and just using the wrist. Where if it's pulling across and extending with good wrist mechanics, it's easier to get the club to basically release like this, where if that left arm is the fulcrum, it's going to start coming up pretty quickly. So I tend to see more contact issues, especially thin iron shots, if you're using that left shoulder as the pure fulcrum. Last questions from Daniel. He asked about overspeed training and single length golf clubs, just kind of wanting to get my take on that. I've addressed overspeed training in at least one of these other YouTube lives. Overspeed training can be very helpful for amplifying your current power source, but I rarely see it add power sources to it. So if you're pretty happy with your sequencing, you're pretty happy with your path, and you just want to rev it up, that can work really well. Or because there's no club face and you're a newer golfer and you have really poor path control, then swinging a weight like the orange whip or the super speed training, those can help you figure out where a good path would be. You still have to figure out how to get a club face that works with a good path, and that's the more I think the bigger challenge and the bigger barrier for golfers. So I get most of my big distance gains from helping golfers develop a better face to path relationship and understanding how to control the bottom of the swing, which frees them up to then use their body more effectively. But overspeed training can be really helpful, especially in like a college player situation where you already have a pretty good swing and you're just kind of trying to ramp it up a little bit. Single length clubs, I don't have a whole lot of experience with it. I think that it, my fear is always it becomes a major challenge when you get into the longer clubs, but it might work pretty well for the shorter clubs. So who knows, maybe down the road we'll have a hybrid set where, most of your wedges are already about the same length. So maybe you'll have like a mid-iron length, a longer club length, and then your driver 3-wood length or something like that. But I don't have that much experience. I haven't coached anyone who's played single length clubs, so I haven't tried them myself. I see Patrick asked a little qualifier, so I'll be more specific. Are we able to see the net force from looking at the hand path on video? You can see the general shape. I'll post a video or I'll link a video in the bottom where I did like a 10-minute talk on looking at the net force. You can see the general shape if you follow the center of mass of the club. You just can't see the magnitude. Like you can't see how much force is being applied, but you can see the general direction and the general shape because the net force will move the center of mass. So like in transition, the center of mass tends to go that way. That's because the overall force is going up slightly. If it goes more like that, then that would be the net force going down. So you can get a decent sense of the net force by looking at video. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for submitting their questions ahead of time. Like I said, I had a lot, didn't quite get through all of them. I'll save a few for the next one, so sorry if I didn't get to address your questions. If you have anything you'd like to see me discuss next time, please send questions to support@golfsmartacademy.com. If you're not a member and you want to see all these different videos that we're talking about, head over to Golf Smart Academy and sign up for a free trial membership. Or if you're looking to get a better sense of my overall teaching philosophy, this is my textbook, the Stock Tour Swing, released in November. I've had a lot of positive responses to it. It takes a lot of the golf science and breaks it down into hopefully digestible chunks, and then if you want to understand one of those chunks a little bit deeper, that's where the videos on the site really come in handy. So thank you again for attending, and send your questions. We'll be ready to do another one of these in the near future.